Hello and welcome to the Palestine Matters podcast series. We're recording this series at the Beyond Borders International Festival at Traquair House in Scotland. Palestine Matters is a joint project of Beyond Borders Scotland and the Britain Palestine Project. Please enjoy this episode.
Welcome. This is the fifth episode of Palestine Matters, the podcast series recorded from the Beyond Borders Festival in Scotland in partnership with the Britain Palestine Project. My name's Safieh. I host the webinar and podcast series for the Britain Palestine Project, which advocates for peace with justice, security and equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. And in this episode, I am joined by Sir Vincent Fean and William Dalrymple. So Vincent is a retired member of the British Diplomatic Service. He was in his last post, Consul-General of Jerusalem, 2010 to 2014. And previous to that was Ambassador to Libya. And previously to that, the High Commissioner to Malta. He's also a trustee of the Britain Palestine Project. He's joined by William Dalrymple, who is a British historian and best-selling author, specializing in the history of empires and their legacy. So he's covered much of South Asia and the Middle East in his writings. He's been vocal on Britain's historic responsibility in the region, more than other countries, in quotation marks, in the Israel-Palestine conflict. He's an advocate for the recognition of the state of Palestine, given how our grandparents' generation treated Palestinians as expendable. Today, we're going to be talking about British legacy in the region. So I'm going to open up with the question, can you outline the ways in which Britain shaped the Israel-Palestine conflict during its rule?
I think it's very probable that there would be no Israel-Palestine conflict had it not been for flat-footed and ignorant British interventions towards the end of the First World War. We are sitting in Traquair in the borders where we're doing this conversation, and I think exactly 79 miles from here is another very similar estate called Whittingham, where Arthur Balfour grew up. Arthur Balfour, when he made the Balfour Declaration, had never been to Palestine, knew very little about its history, knew no Arabs socially, and seems to be completely ignorant about the makeup of Palestine. At the time of the Balfour Declaration, when he was growing up, when Zionist immigration into Palestine was still in its infancy, there was probably about 5% of the Palestinian population that was Jewish. By the time that the Balfour Declaration was made in 1917, it was probably about 10% Jewish. 10% was Christian Palestinian, who are often ignored, but who are the descendants of the very first Christians. Many of them no doubt converted from Judaism in the early centuries of Christianity. And then the remaining 80% of Palestine's population was Muslim. We know quite clearly from various notes taken by the Peel Commission a generation later, when the problems of in the 1920s, when the initial signs of tension in the region, as the Palestinians quite understandably showed anxiety about the level and size of immigration into Palestine from outside. We know from the workings of that committee that they say that the original team that issued the Balfour Declaration had no concept that what they call the non-Jewish communities of Palestine, and dismiss as if they're a small minority, were in fact the overwhelming majority of the population, at least 90% of the Palestinian population. And as early as the 1920s, there was widespread recognition in Britain that the ignorance of the British political establishment about that region, about the makeup of that region, had laid the foundations for the conflict, which of course is raging every day today. And it was British policy that led first to massive emigration of European and some Middle Eastern Jews into Palestine, which then put down very violently Palestinian resistance to that immigration. And it's only now, I think, that coming out the sheer horror of the British anti-insurgency techniques, which were used by people like Orde Wingate and Bomber Harris, who, in the case of Bomber Harris, strafed Palestinian villages and bombed them from the air. And in the case of Orde Wingate, led night raids and developed torture techniques, often which early versions of waterboarding, which would leave no subsequent injuries to illustrate what had taken place. And so what you get with the Palestinian Revolt in the 1930s is Britain not only puts it down with extreme violence and torture, or torture of the sort that we have come to associate, my generation associated with the Gestapo in war films, but never thought that our own people inflicted it on their subjects, their colonial subjects, the subjects of their empire. And at the same time as bombing, strafing, torturing, frightening, terrorizing the Palestinians into submission, they disarmed the Palestinian population, exiled its leadership to places like Cyprus and the Seychelles, and trained up the underground of the Jewish population in military techniques and in techniques of torture and subjugation. So much so that Orde Wingate is now recognised as one of the fathers of the IDF in a memorial tomb put up in London. So, both in terms of creating a very, very large Jewish population in Mandate Palestine, then organising violent subjugation of those that resisted it. And then finally, and most critically, in walking out and leaving Palestine, providing absolutely no safeguards for the indigenous Palestinian population. And obviously a protectorate, in the nature of it, inherent in the word, is the idea of protecting those people. The British in Palestine quite obviously did the very opposite. They took a population that had no tradition of communal violence. There was no religious riots in Palestine before 1917. I don't want to romanticize the Ottoman Empire, and there were, for example, riots in Damascus in 1860, but there was nothing of that sort in Palestine. And Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities not only rubbed along pretty well in pre-Mandate Palestine, they shared sacred spaces. So there's a church in Bet Sahor where the Christians would go to sacrifice sheep to St. George, who was, of course, a Palestinian from Lydda.
I remind people of this every St. George's Day, yes.
The Jewish population of Palestine, who called themselves Palestinian in the pre-Mandate period, and were very much part of the Palestinian population and well integrated into it, came along to bring sheep for the saint they regarded as the prophet Elijah. And the Muslims brought sheep to be sacrificed to Khizr, the green saint. And if one reads the anthropological writings from the early 1920s and earlier by figures like Tawfiq Kenan, one gets the impression of a very cosmopolitan world that was internally very coherent, with very established traditions in each of the different urban centres. In those days, in Ottoman times, people often, as well as their religious identity, they identified with their cities. So Jerusalemites very much identified with Jerusalem, Bethlehem,
side by side.
Yeah, right. And that was, in a sense, your primary identifier of sort of geographical identity. And these cities were very, very mixed, and Jews, different kinds of Muslim, huge variety of different kinds of Christians, as well as sort of Yazidis and Druze, a large Druze majority, Circassian communities, all rubbed along pretty well together. And it was not until the Balfour Declaration and the massive emigration that followed it, that you get violence and instability and the Palestinian population at the end of 1948, after the Nakba, 75% of the indigenous Palestinians are refugees. Now, many of those go to Lebanon and to Beirut and refugee camps there. Some internally were driven to places like Nazareth, but then also into the West Bank. But the great majority go to Gaza. And it is the refugees of 1948 who are the parents and grandparents of the kids we see being massacred every morning on our mobile phones. And so there is not a tangential link, but a direct responsibility of the British. And the great tragedy is, I think, that while the British are now thankfully very well educated about horrors such as the Holocaust and the death of 6 million Jews by the Nazis in concentration camps, almost no one learns what happens to the Palestinians. So there is inherently at large in Britain an extreme sympathy with the position of Jews who have suffered centuries of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust, but a complete lack of awareness of the horrors suffered by the Palestinians at British hands. And that produces a fundamental imbalance when the British public hear reports from Palestine. They know about anti-Semitism, they know the ghastly history of European anti-Semitism, but they're completely ignorant about who the Palestinians are, why they're in Gaza in the first place, why they're suffering, what their grievances are. And the less well educated you are, the more you just tend to assume that the Palestinians are troublemakers, who are, in inverted commas, terrorists, who are always, in inverted commas, creating trouble, and so on. So it's a classic example of how the British education system has failed to educate people and give them the necessary background in order to make informed decisions about the politics of the modern world.
Imperial Britain, I agree, fully. Imperial Britain has form in Palestine, and that form has a legacy, and the legacy we witness today. Just to add a couple of points, the activities of the British, first of all, the League of Nations mandate, the mandate that they acquired, that they sought and acquired to run Palestine, what is now Israel and Palestine, around about 1923, says that the protectorate, the protecting state, the state which has the mandate, has the responsibility to guide its people to independence. Cobbled onto that was the Balfour Declaration, as William has said, and that contradicts, in a sense, because it talks about creating a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, as if it would have no impact on the majority of the population who were already there, who are Arab. Just adding, in the Arab Revolt that Williams referred to between 36 and 39, Britain introduced some emergency regulations, which are still being implemented by the Israeli government today. They have never been repealed, and they're being used, and they include what we used to call internment. Now it's administrative detention, i.e. locking up people without trial and without access to lawyers for long periods, extensible periods.
Years,
years,
in many cases.
Can be years. That includes children, children under 18. And the way in which that mandate was actually carried out is described by a British, Jewish, late lamented historian, Sir Martin Gilbert, as being the only consistent thing that the British did during the mandate period was to ensure that there were no representative institutions in Mandate Palestine for as long as there was an Arab majority. Just to add to that, it's often said that the Nakba began in 48. It didn't. It began in 47. 1/3 of those 750,000 majority in Palestine who were expelled, evicted, forced out, frightened out, that began in 47 under our watch. And then we walked and we ran in May 48. Last thing, the currency. I'm not an expert on this, but I am told that as one of the acts of the British government before departure, they took the Palestinian pound out of the sterling area, which meant that Palestinian bank accounts were worthless. So Palestinians started with nothing in May 1948. That might be an explanation as to why the shekel has taken over in such a big way and is used by Palestinians and Israelis currently. So we have form, we have responsibility, moral responsibility. It is very little known, as William has said. Your podcasts and this podcast, I hope, will help to shed some light. Our charity tries to do the same with a couple of films, one about the period 1917 to 48, the British period, if you like, and then secondly, a newer film about the Nakba to Camp David, so 48 to 79. They're available, and we would like to show them to people to learn more. And then knowledge produces, how should we put it, produces commitment, because there has to be a British commitment to work for a better future for both Israelis and for Palestinians. We have that moral responsibility. Next month, in September, I trust that Britain and Australia, Canada, France and Malta and others will recognise the state of Palestine belatedly, making more than 150 states out of 193 in the UN that do so. It needs to mean more than symbolism. It needs to mean more than an action that is then an episode. It needs to mean a new beginning for the relationship between Britain and Palestinians.
You talked a lot about the education and the understanding. You talked about the Christian population of Palestine. I am a Palestinian Christian. I regularly get asked when I converted to Christianity, and I have to remind people where Jesus was born, in my country. So on that note, why do you think that the issue of Palestine and Israel are so neglected in British education, and what are the consequences?
I don't think it's a policy of deliberate and conscious leaving the British people in ignorance about a painful chapter. In general, Britain's empire is not taught, and despite the fact that whatever it is, a fifth of our population is now from the subcontinent and other parts of the empire. There is remarkably little teaching of how South Asia, how the Caribbean, there is a little on the slave trade, in fairness, but there's absolutely nothing about, in the core curriculum, about the conquest of India. So there's a wider malaise whereby our history curriculum is simply not fit for purpose for modern Britain, and does not provide even the basics for understanding how so many of our population are from former colonies. And the phrase "we are here because you were there" is one that needs to be sort of sitting on the desk of who's ever refining and changing our British curriculum. So the neglect of Palestinian history is part of a much wider failure to educate the British on their responsibility for many things in the world. And that starts actually with Ireland, with our immediate neighbour, where the British, in a sense, had their laboratory for empire. The very first attempts at settlements, at exchanging population, at apartheid systems, and so on, was in Cromwellian era Ireland, 200 or 300 years before the mandate, and so this is part of a much wider failure. But at the moment, when every single day the Middle East is on the front page of our newspapers and in our news bulletins, it's horrific that there's been absolutely no attempt by, for example, the BBC to make proper documentaries about Israel-Palestine. I mean, there is absolutely nothing to teach the British people about their responsibility, but also about what's going on in Gaza, the roots of it. And we realized this lately when we were thinking about my Empire podcast. Anita Anand and I do a Girl Hanger podcast called Empire. And we're just launching a 12-part history of Gaza, which is going to be a very deep dive, 12 hours, with the leading experts on every period of this history will be coming out next month.
That's fascinating.
But what was shocking was that when we began to research around this, we noticed that not only in Britain, but nowhere in the world has there been a really detailed attempt to teach the history of any of this. Not just the Nakba, but who are the Palestinians, who were the Philistines, when does the notion of the word Palestinian, and I mean, I have to say, even I, who've been specializing in this for 30 years, had no idea that the first references to Palestinians are in Egyptian hieroglyphs from 1400 BC, where you get the word Peliset being used by Tutmosis III to describe the people south of Phoenicia and north of Egypt. That you find a version of that word, Palashtu, being used by the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians. And then that is Hellenicized by the time of the Greeks. So Herodotus talks about Syria Palestina. And this is all different versions of the same word. Peliset, Palashtu, Palestina, Philistine in Hebrew is all describing the same thing.
And goes to contradict this argument that we hear regularly that there's no such thing as Palestinians.
It's completely historically illiterate to maintain that, and while the population is certainly like in the rest of the Levant on the move, so there are migrations into and out of Syria and Iraq and Egypt, and at no point is it a static and unchanging population. The whole of the Middle East is constantly on the move. Nonetheless, DNA testing shows very clearly that there is a strong degree of continuity from Bronze Age skeletons onwards to the present population. Now, there is a ranking of how close the Bronze Age population is to the different groups that live in the land today. And highest is the Samaritans, who have never intermarried at any point, tiny community near Nablus.
In Nablus.
They have an almost identical DNA to the skeletons being dug up out of excavations. Next up, Palestinian Christians, who have something like a 75% crossover with the DNA of people being dug up out of the ground. Next up, Palestinian Muslims, and pretty close to that, Mizrahi Palestinian Jews. And those are next. And then you come down, right down, and Ashkenazi Jews at the bottom of this list, with links, absolutely, with links to that population, but a lower degree of DNA crossover to those early skeletons at the Bronze Age. So almost everyone in this conflict actually comes from the same gene pool at some degree, and so this is a family dispute.
Yeah, they're cousins.
One of the great tragedies.
Cousins,
you are cousins, and everyone is related up to a certain point, and everyone does have some sort of claim to calling this a homeland, which is a crucial bit of the background. So. Both for those Palestinians who say that the Israelis are Europeans who came in and have no link, but particularly for those Zionists who say the Palestinians have no link to the land and arrived either to build the kibbutzes in the 1920s or in another version of the myth, arrived on camels from Saudi Arabia after the death of the Prophet in the 7th century. That is all just historically illiterate. To put one particularly important piece of history on the table, the Arab conquests, as they're called, of the 7th century are archaeologically invisible. There's almost no sign of them at all. Of all the different population movements, of which there are many over the course of 4,000, 5,000 years, the 7th century invasion is the one that's most difficult to find in an archaeological context, with the exception of massive monuments like the Dome of the Rock or the Umayyad Palace in Jericho. But in the vast mass of villages and towns in Palestine, the population continued. And what you get is two things. You get a gradual, over a period of 200 or 300 years, you get increasing use of Arabic over Greek. But Greek continues to be the language of administration well into the Umayyad period, with figures like John of Damascus, who were Christian, Greek-speaking Byzantines of local origin, continuing to administer until he goes over and becomes a monk and then a saint in Marsaba in the West Bank. And you actually get an increase in church building after the Islamic conquest, because most of the Christians, certainly further into the desert in what's now Jordan, many of those were Monophysite and repressed by the Orthodox in Byzantine times. So you get, there's an archaeologist called Michele Piccirillo who spent his life digging up early Umayyad period. Well, he thought he was digging up for many years Byzantine churches in the desert. It turns out actually with carbon dating and with increased archaeological sophistication, that many of these Byzantine churches built in the Byzantine style were in fact early Umayyad churches. And there's a massive increase in church building in the immediate period after the Islamic conquest. And there is no exchange of population. The Arabs who come with the Caliph Omar are a military elite who have spread very thinly over a vast empire that stretches very soon from the Indus to Spain. And so the population which is there in Byzantine times is more or less the population which is there.
Which is still there.
Well, we can't wait to listen to your podcast.
Absolutely. No, we've got 12 hours to which I look forward to. Just a very quick word on the activities of the charity, which we try to raise awareness on the history, on the responsibility, and on the current situation, obviously. We have a website, www.britainpalestineproject.org. It is a source of information and objective information about the UK role in this conflict up to the present day. We also have a webinar series that Deanna organises and hosts, and one day we would very much like to share that platform with you.
Happy to help in any way.
Thank you very much.
We all have a responsibility.
And I think we should all try. And we also try to get into schools to help with the awareness raising in an objective fashion, with always in our minds the idea that the outcome that we seek from this conflict is equal rights for Palestinians and Israelis, and a fulfillment of British responsibility to do better.
Well, on that note, thank you, Vincent. It leads very nicely into my next question. Based on this historic responsibility that Britain has in the region, what do you think that Britain needs to do now going forward on this issue?
Well, the first thing is going to happen next month in September. That's the recognition. It's not enough. I and many have been working for this outcome for more than a decade. It's been long overdue. Britain recognized Israel in 1950, and it's high time that the second state in this famous two-state solution is recognized. People often ask what territory. It should be the territory that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, last July 2024, opined, advised, is Gaza, East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank should be vacated. The occupation is unlawful by Israel and should end. So that is the territory that we're talking about. 78 or 79% of mandate Palestine being Israel, and the remainder 21-22% being Palestine. It's not enough. There need to be accompanying measures to ensure that there is a Palestine to recognize and that the genocide in Gaza ceases. That requires more than the UK, but it also requires the UK. And the UK has this moral responsibility and should give a lead. And should also seek to persuade the United States to intervene to stop the deliberate policy of starvation.
Intervene in a positive way, we should say, for once.
Yes, quite.
Yes.
Intervene to stop something bad.
I personally think that something stronger is needed, because Netanyahu and his extremist government are completely immune to mild criticism and raps on the knuckles. And there are many recordings of Netanyahu dismissing those, both in Europe and in America, who have tried to advocate a two-state solution. And he has been very clear that his opposition to a two-state solution is absolute, and that he's been working all his life to ensure it will never happen and it will be stillborn. And it seems to me that we're in a situation now where we need to go beyond recognition and start taking active measures to inflict the same sort of pain on Israel as was imposed on South Africa in order to push it gently towards ending apartheid, which was obviously a very effective campaign, which resulted in Nelson Mandela coming out of prison and a peace and reconciliation progress. This has led to the modern South African state, which is no longer an apartheid system. I don't think anything less than, well, first of all, definitely immediately ending all arms sales. Contrary to their public declarations, Britain is still working with Eblet systems and similar Israeli arms dealers and arms sellers. This has to end immediately. But I think we also need sanctions, boycott, disinvestment at the government and at the private level. And we have to stop regarding Israel as a mature democracy with values similar to ours, when clearly it is at the moment under the extremist Netanyahu government an extremely racist apartheid regime, which, while providing absolutely democratic safeguards for Jewish citizens in Israel, provides the Arab Palestinians living in Israel with minor discriminations on land, education, access to jobs, and so on, and then complete subjugation of the Palestinian population in Gaza and in the West Bank. And we need recognition by the British government of what the ICJ has opined, which this is an apartheid system, that this is an occupation, that it is illegal, because it's very clear that just mild rebukes and occasional statements are going to do absolutely nothing. And our historic responsibility is such, having created this situation, where we do now need to add diplomatic pressure in the same way that we are doing with Russia, and the same sort of sanctions which have been taken out against Putin should be taken out against Netanyahu, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Yeah. And hopefully that will, in time, lead if enough of the world does this, will lead the Israeli people to see benefits in risking peace. And obviously it is a risk. There is
peaceful coexistence.
Peaceful coexistence is not something which is easy. After October the 7th, both sides have radicalized. And it is going to take a leap of faith by Israelis as well as Palestinians to dream of a world where coexistence side by side can happen. But we have to do more than merely make vacuous statements while selling arms and taking money from Israeli lobby groups and so on. And that era is now over. When we have genocide, when we have the imminent extinction of the people of Gaza, if not complete genocide. But I mean, there is a genocide going on, but it's not a total wipeout yet. But there is clearly plans for ethnic cleansing.
There's every risk of erasure, every risk.
And in the West Bank.
Yeah. If I can add just one point about the West Bank. In my time, when William Hague was Foreign Secretary, settlement expansion was happening. It's happening all the time. It's been accelerated greatly, and the recent announcement of settlement building on E1 will complete the separation of East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank, which is by design, and divide the West Bank in two. The aim being, the declared aim, as you said, William, being to erase the two-state outcome, which is international policy. In my time, in 1 year, and I counted it, William Hague or Alistair Burt, his deputy, condemned settlement expansion 20 times. 20 times in a year, because there were various plans advanced. it was water off a duck's back. It had no impact because there was no effect. There was no consequence. It was a statement. It passed. A week later, something else happened. So statements aren't enough. The measures that you've mentioned, like arms embargo in both directions, sales and purchases, military cooperation, suspension of our bilateral trade agreement with Israel, banning settlement trade in goods and services. Those are things that our charity advocates, and we try to ensure that our supporters talk to their MPs, write to their MPs about this, to try and ensure that those ideas become mainstream. They're not yet. They need to be mainstream in the thinking of our cabinet and of our Prime Minister. Those things are necessary to accompany recognition. They don't take away from the value of recognition, but they are not enough. Recognition on its own is not enough.
Well, before we wrap this episode up, I think we have a lovely announcement to make based about our charity and about William. I don't know if you want to be the one to announce this great news.
To my great pleasure and that of Andrew Whitley, our chair, William Dalrymple has kindly agreed to become a patron of our charity, alongside a couple of bishops and some peers, Peter Hain and other colleagues. It's a great honour for us that you should do so.
It's a great honour for me to be asked. Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to cooperating more, webinaring more, and indeed particularly to listening to your analysis of the history of Gaza, because it is an undiscovered area. You've found it, you've dealt with it, and we look forward to hearing more about it.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you both for speaking to us today and to speaking to our listeners, and thank you to our listeners as well for following us.
Thank you
very much.